Hello and welcome, and thank you so much for braving the DC closures to get here. I mean, it's been quite a hassle, and we're right on the intersection and corner of all of the road closures for this nonsensical military parade that's going to be taking place this weekend. So we're very grateful for your attendance, and thank you very much for everyone who's joining us online who couldn't be here today in person because of these closures. So we're very delighted to have you with us. My name's Fadi Khaf'iti. I'm the executive director here at the Jerusalem Fund and Palestine Center in Washington, D.C. For those who are joining us online who might not be familiar with our work, the Jerusalem Fund for Community Education and Community Development is a grassroots 501c3 registered nonprofit that supports community development in Palestine while educating people in the United States on the question of Palestine and increasing political awareness on issues relating to Palestine. All of our events are free and open to the public, and most of them are live streamed to a global audience, like today's event. You can find us online on Twitter and Instagram with Palestine Center on X and Palestine Center DC on Instagram. We're also very excited to be co-hosting this event with the Green and Red podcast run jointly by Professor Bob Buzzanco and Scott Parkin, who co-hosts a regular podcast to discuss radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics with organizers, academics, artists, and more. We're honored today to have a lecture with Professor Robert Bob Buzzanco, who's Professor Emeritus at the University of Houston, who'll be giving a talk titled Vietnam Then, Palestine Now, U.S. Subversion of Liberation Movements. As he remarks in the summary of his talk, the U.S. role in the genocide in Gaza is a well-established horror, but it's also the example of the many ways that American leaders have always suppressed liberation movements. In looking at today's events with historical context, especially with regard to the war and devastation in Vietnam, it can tell us a good deal about the way that the U.S. views people's movements abroad and how they form and evolve and what the outcomes are. So, as the global hegemon and the most powerful imperial superpower in modern history, no discussion on Palestine can be complete without understanding the role of the United States, not only in the current iteration of the U.S. genocide, the Israeli genocide on Gaza, and the prevention of course, Palestine's right to self-determination, but in financing, arming, supplying, and providing diplomatic immunity for counter-revolutionary and pariah states like the settler colonial entity of Israel, the illegitimate regime in South Vietnam, and the apartheid settler regime in South Africa, and many more. While the majority of our events at the Jerusalem Fund are specifically on Palestine, we host, like today, speakers whose expertise lay beyond the scope of Palestine, but whose research and political activism relate their work and practices to the question of Palestine and its liberation. That's why we're delighted to have Professor Bob Buzzanco here to share his insights on the Vietnamese Revolution and their struggles against U.S. empire, offering a structural analysis of how imperial forces crush by design liberation movements wherever they may be. Robert Buzzanco is the co-host of Green and Red podcast, as I mentioned before, and Professor Emeritus at the University of Houston, and has been a visiting professor of Ca' Foscari University in Venice. He's the author of several books, including the award-winning Masters of War, Military Dissent and Politics in the Vietnam Era, published in 1996, which received the Stuart L. Bernath Book and Lecture Prizes, given by the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations. Professor Buzzanco specializes in, writes about, and talks on the Vietnam War era, military-civilian relations, foreign policy, radical social movements, political economy, anti-imperialism, and other topics in U.S. history. He's also been a lifelong activist for Palestine solidarity movements. I must say, at a personal note, on a pedagogical level, I had the fortune of working for Professor Buzzanco as a teaching assistant for his U.S. history seminar at the University of Houston, which is a requirement for all students passing through the college system in Texas. But it was through him that I owe so much of my interest, not only in radical and revolutionary politics, subverts, but also how to teach about the U.S. and Palestine. See, Bob was the first U.S. historian I encountered who dedicated the full week of his course specifically to teaching about Palestine, learning about how it evolved, the rise of settler colonialism in Palestine, the emergence of the State of Israel, and its imperial aggression and expansionism in the Arab world. So I'm honored and delighted to have you here with us, Professor Buzzanco. So please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, Fadi. It's a great pleasure and an honor, and I'm very fortunate to have gotten to know you. Fadi was, like as he pointed out, my TA, and I have to say, in many ways, he's the teacher and I'm the student when it comes to learning about this region and the politics and the history. We've spent many evenings going into detail about this, and I learned a great deal from him. So I really do appreciate it. And thank you for coming out. I know it's rough today, and thank you for organizing this big parade in my honor tomorrow. So you're right. I'm not a specialist. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert in the Arab world, but I do think that there are great lessons to be learned by studying other areas and to see how the United States responds. And I want to begin to kind of describe this with a personal vignette. Long ago, well into the 20th century, I was always interested in history and politics, and this was probably somewhere in the mid-'70s. A magazine had a Yasser Arafat on the cover, which I found intriguing. And I read the article, which kind of took the typical narrative about, the Palestinians are terrorists and this and that. But, there was a spark in me saying, I want to learn more. And the reason I was interested in learning more, and the reason I had some questions about what I had just read, was because I had already started studying the Vietnam War, just because it was there. It was a big part of my life. I had an older brother who, had been eligible for the draft. People I know had served in Vietnam. And it was because of what I understood about Vietnam that made me more or less question what I had read in that article about Palestine. And so I went, before Google and everything else, I literally went to the library and just started looking for stuff. And in that way, from a very early stage in my life, I discovered what was happening there, and became a partisan in that issue as well. I know I've told Fadi in my college dorm room, I had a bunch of junk on the walls, but I had a Palestinian flag taped to my wall, along with pictures of who knows who at the time, Mickey Mantle or somebody, I don't know, probably not, but still. So I learned a great deal about Palestine from studying Vietnam, and I still think that's a valuable lesson there, that we can learn about a lot of different historical episodes, not obviously to study them, but also from understanding these larger contexts. I'll probably speak a little bit more about Vietnam, actually, than the Middle East, but obviously afterward we can have questions, or we can talk about anything that you might have in mind about that. Talking about Vietnam today is very different than it was some time ago. Like all episodes, history changes, the history of them changes, but not because what happened changed, but because the way we look at it changes. There's a very famous quote from Orwell, which I'm sure you've all heard, along the lines of whoever controls the past controls the present and therefore controls the future. So it's what people say about a particular event that becomes important. Nietzsche said what we call things is more important than what they are. In 2017, there was a huge national kind of campaign to promote a new PBS special by the very famous documentarian Ken Burns about Vietnam, and it got all kinds of attention and acclaim. And in it, Burns takes what had become a fairly common idea, and he begins with the idea that the Vietnam War was more or less a noble cause, which is also the phrases that both Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan used, that the U.S. went in there with the best of intentions and they made a mistake. And this reminds me today of a lot of the media reports we get where they talk about Israel being the most moral army in the world or the only democracy in the region. So what you call things becomes more important than what they are. At the time, I wrote somewhat extensively about Ken Burns critiquing it. The United States was well aware of what was going on in Vietnam. It didn't go in with blinders any more than it's supporting with billions of dollars in weapons what's happening today, an actual genocide. And the word genocide was actually used quite a bit in the 60s. It didn't gain traction somewhat in Cambodia, right? And so there are significant parallels. And in fact, last night, when I read about the attack, the Israeli attack on Iran, it kind of reminds you of the United States expanding the war when it was fighting in Vietnam already into the adjacent states of Cambodia and Laos. And that regional element is really important, I think, in both of these cases, right? The Vietnam War was catastrophic. I think we don't think about it as much as we once did. I think it was one of the more important events in the 20th century after World War II, the most important event in the 20th century with significant meaning still to this day. To a large degree, Vietnam, the response to the Vietnam War, the lessons learned of the Vietnam War shaped much of what's occurred since then. For the U.S., the losses were great, 58,000 dead, huge amounts of money spent. It's hard to get a real bead on what was actually spent in Vietnam, but there are some estimates that it was adjusted for today's dollar, in the vicinity of like $1.5 or $2 trillion that the United States spent in Vietnam. Vietnam obviously took the brunt of it. And that's the thing to keep in mind, too. We tend to focus on the United States in these episodes, but the United States lost 58,000 soldiers. The Vietnamese probably had 2 to 3 million killed, the vast majority of whom were civilians, were non-combatants, and were actually living north of the 17th parallel where Vietnam had been cut in half. And so we see that today where, we have these massive losses of civilian lives and attacks on civilian installations, schools, universities, hospitals, and so forth that happened in Vietnam as well. So just kind of a little bit of background. I'm not a political science, so I don't want to go too far into this. In the period after World War II, both Southeast Asia, where Vietnam is located, and the Middle East became more important to the United States. And I want to just one little bit of theory that I do throw out there because I think it's kind of an important and intriguing idea. And this comes from a friend of mine who's a scholar in Australia named Clinton Fernandez, who writes a lot about sub-imperial powers. And he writes about Australia, but he also has written, along with Israel and mentioned Singapore, sub-imperial powers share certain features that characterize them, the sub-imperial powers. They're capable, they have technologically advanced militaries and intelligence services that operate in the entire region and far afield to uphold a U.S.-led order. Trade investment agreements are organized with a similar goal in mind. Public opinion in these countries tends to be pro-U.S., obviously. They have stable governments, more or less, strong economic performance, and educated citizens. And I think when we look at Israel today in particular, it does fit that framework of a sub-imperial power operating to defend American interests. I know there's a big debate, we're not going to get into it now, over who actually controls whom, right? Does Israel control the U.S. or vice versa? I tend to still accept a kind of an older argument put forth by a lot of people that America's interest in Israel is based on having an ally in the region, or as Noam Chomsky called it, a cop on the beat. There's no doubt that there are influences with groups like AIPAC. We see that every election year. But Israel serves a purpose to defend American interest, and that grows increasingly after World War II. So the bigger question is, how did the United States come to fight and sponsor and support these very bloody wars in both Vietnam and today in Palestine? One of the more important things to remember as we start out is that both of these exist because of larger interests. They're not really about, per se, Vietnam or Palestine, although those are the areas that take the biggest hits in these catastrophes, in these massive wars with massive uses of technology and just, kind of the most brutal modern wars that we've seen. So there are larger interests. So, for instance, in Vietnam and Asia, America's role, especially after October 1st, 1949, when the Chinese Revolution succeeded, changed. And the United States after China went communist, found it absolutely critical, essential to preserve Japan, country it had just defeated, as an American ally in order to develop capitalist economies in Asia. So America's goal initially was to have both Japan and China in America's orbit. And as the Chinese piece of that fell apart, Japan became more important. And because of that, places like Vietnam become important. If you want Japan to be the kind of leader, the core of capitalism in Asia, then the surrounding areas have to be part of that economic orbit as well. So that becomes very important. And then I would argue that the Middle East is similar to that. After World War II, during and after World War II, the Middle East became far more important, especially in World War II, for things like oil, shipping lanes in the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, and so forth. And so Israel and then Palestine would fit into that larger framework as well. Internally, when we say why Vietnam or why Gaza today, one of the crucial issues is going to be land. And that's similar in both places. Inside Vietnam, and this is Vietnam is a pre-modern society when this begins. The Vietnamese Revolution, the groundwork is laid really in the World War I era. So the struggle is about land. In parts of Vietnam, in Vietnam itself, less than 2% of Vietnamese owned land. Vietnam was a French colony, and so the biggest landholders tended to be somehow collaborating or part of the administrative apparatus of the French, which means that the vast majority of Vietnamese, I think the population of Vietnam, I believe, is about 25 million in the World War II era. So it's substantially larger as well in terms of population. And the vast majority of those people had no land at all. And so when the revolution began, one of the key slogans was land to the tiller, right? Land to the people who own it. I don't see the word settlements being used, but essentially that's kind of what we're talking about. And obviously, when it comes to the Middle East, we've all seen those maps of land ownership, right? In the early 1900s, and then the 1947 map, the UN partition map, the 1967 map, and so on. So the ownership of the actual land there, and the type of land you own, land that's actually arable, land that has irrigation available, is really crucial in both places. In both countries, you have more so in Palestine an indigenous population, although you could probably say that about Vietnam as well because of the French role there. But you have large indigenous populations in both places labeled invaders. So the West begins to essentially deny their own history. In Vietnam, the media, which Ken Burns in 2017 accepted, put out the line that North Vietnam had invaded South Vietnam, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And that's not really that dissimilar to saying that Palestine was a land without people, for a people without land. The Vietnamese Revolution, there's no official starting date or anything like that, but the roots of it can be seen in the World War I era. Because Vietnam was a French colony, you had significant numbers of expats living in Paris, especially younger Vietnamese who were nationalists. They were educated, they were trained in these kind of nationalist ideas. They were closely connected to this idea of kind of an Asian response to white supremacy, what they would have called white supremacy. These expats in France included people who would become very well known in the 50s and 60s leading the war. Obviously, the best known was a young man named Nguyen Quoc, who became Ho Chi Minh, Va Nguyen Giap, Trong Chin, Lê Duan, Lê Duc Tho, and many, many others. They actually formed an Indo-Chinese Communist Party. So the war in Vietnam is kind of a hybrid. During the war, the U.S. would always argue that it had to stop communism in Vietnam. A lot of the critics of America would say it's not a communist country, it's nationalist. Well, it's both, right? The people who ran the revolution were part of the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, but it was not confined to that. Anybody could really be part of it. If you were anti-French, you could be part of it. So it's actually a huge front. And though the leaders and much of the ideological program would be labeled communist or leftist or something, the movement itself was not. I would probably suggest 80% of the people initially opposed to it were not communists. They're Buddhist intellectuals, just people who didn't like France, right? So during the 1930s, then, these folks who had met in Paris and elsewhere formed a group, an organization inside Vietnam called the Viet Minh. And the Viet Minh began to lead the resistance to the French in the 1930s, and not without meaning. It really kind of coincides with the Palestine Revolution of the late 1930s too. So this is occurring in both places, and there is this kind of beginning of this worldwide anti-colonial movement that you see. And I would argue that the Vietnamese and the Palestinians are both part of that. This took on more urgency as Japan during World War II, which was trying to gain control over all of Asia, went into Vietnam and kicked out the French. And so Japan took over Vietnam, and the Viet Minh, Ho Chi Minh and his comrades were very vital in that resistance. They worked, in fact, they worked closely with the Americans, with the Organization of Strategics, the OSS, the precursor to the CIA, to rescue, for instance, pilots who were downed in Chinese airspace and things like that. The United States is already involved in that region, but it's not terribly important to them. And they actually have a pretty good impression of Ho Chi Minh as well, which was interesting. So the Viet Minh were vital in that resistance. And so when Japan finally lost after the atomic bombs were dropped in early September of 1945, Ho Chi Minh, who was the leader of the Viet Minh, went out into the main square in Hanoi and announced the creation of, or announced basically a Vietnamese Declaration of Independence, the creation of a Vietnamese state. And ironically, within Ho's speech, he quoted the Declaration of Independence. He began by saying, "We hold these truths to be evident that all men and women are created equal." He invoked Thomas Paine and the rights of man. He reached out to the United States. The Vietnamese sent letters to Harry Truman and others in Washington saying, "Hey, we want some kind of a relationship." The United States rejected that because they said, well, the Vietnamese are just China's puppets. They're just another part of the Chinese Communist movement, which couldn't have been further from the truth. Vietnam and China don't like each other at all, and really still don't, right? So after that, the French, even though the French had been kicked out by the Japanese, France seemed to be, kind of fading. Colonialism seemed to be fading. There was a lot of anti-colonial rhetoric coming out of places like Washington, D.C., Franklin Roosevelt especially. But that anti-colonial rhetoric wasn't based on the idea that people should be sovereign or they should be free. Anti-colonial rhetoric is based on the idea that markets should be free. Colonies, remember, are closed. You can only trade within the home country or whatever. That's why the United States opposed colonialism, and it opposed Britain, it opposed France and all these other countries, right? In the third world, what we would call the third world, the message came across differently. So when they heard Westerners talking about anti-colonialism, they believed that that meant independence for themselves. This reminds me in 1917, Woodrow Wilson said that, that World War I was a war to make the world safe for democracy. Inside the U.S., African-American activists heard that and thought, oh, well, if he's going to make the world safe for democracy, that includes us. Woodrow Wilson never meant that. And the U.S. didn't really mean that either when it talked about anti-colonialism. So the French went back in and reestablished control over Vietnam. Again, it's not a direct parallel to Israel and Palestine, but clearly you have the same dynamics working there. The United States had, and again, larger interests, and I think that's one of the important parallels between these. America's interests were regional. It didn't want to alienate France. The United States actually tried to discourage the French from going in and reestablishing control of Vietnam because it wanted France to be focused totally on Europe and the Cold War in Europe and the Soviet Union. But when France said no, the U.S. went along because it didn't want to alienate them, and it also didn't want to give support to the French left. The idea of politics and elections is really crucial in both places. The United States was always meddling in elections in both places, often making sure that its guy won, or in the case of, let's say, Gaza, trying to make sure that the wrong people didn't win, and when they did, having to kind of go in and try to adapt after that. So the French went back in because they wanted to keep France kind of happy in Egypt. In Europe. They also wanted, as I mentioned a minute ago, Asian allies for Japan. They wanted the Japanese to feel like they had other nations nearby with whom they could trade, where they could get resources, where they could have security arrangements, right? There was also an economic reason, which I'm not going to go into, but it's interesting. At the end of World War II, the world was just destroyed. And the United States wasn't. The war wasn't fought in the US. And so the United States was at its productive peak, but it didn't have anywhere to sell this stuff. And one of the problems was that there are potential markets all over, countries badly in need of reconstruction materials, but they don't have money. So another reason to go into places like Vietnam was because of the so-called dollar gap. The United States went into these areas to give them money so that they could then in turn back and purchase goods from the United States, right? These are often referred to as offset arrangements, and one need only look at the amount of weapons the United States has, sold to Israel over the years to get a real sense of that. In 2022, before Russia invaded Ukraine, and then again in right after October 2023, many of the military-industrial corporations, Raytheon and so forth, were publicly tweeting about how good this was going to be for their stock prices and how good it was going to be for business. So they were pretty candid about that, and you clearly see that as well with regard to Vietnam, to kind of try to give money to these Asian countries so that they can in turn spend it back and alleviate this dollar gap, right? So all these things are going on. An area that had not been terribly important to the U.S. suddenly is becoming more so. Much of this early phase, as I mentioned, does seem to parallel the Palestinian revolution of the 1930s. These are both pre-industrial societies and are heavily industrialized, right? They involve workers and peasants in both particular cases. These are groups, the Viet Minh and the Palestinians, who do not have important allies all over the globe. They're localized rebellions without a great deal of outside support. And obviously, we know that with regard to Palestine, the Europeans since World War I era had been trying to, dispossess them, right? The Balfour Declarations in 1917, and then you have European support of settlement into the region, largely because the Europeans were so actually really anti-Semitic, right? They wanted them out, right? So both Vietnam and Palestine in this era, the World War II, early Cold War years, are part of this world historical anti-colonial movement. And the United States, very simply, and I don't think I have to explain this much because it's pretty obvious, the United States has always been hostile to liberation movements, right? And you could find, I'm talking about Vietnam today because I know it well. I could have talked about Cuba. I could have talked about Indonesia. I could have talked about Venezuela. Could have talked about Iran, could have talked about, Suez. There's a million different things that fit into this. But in that era, obviously, Vietnam was the biggest, right? And today, obviously, it's the Middle East. In 1946, then, after France came back in, the so-called First Indochina War began. And this is just a couple of years before the recognition of Israel. So again, there are parallels. And then by the early 1950s, the United States had begun sending huge amounts of money, hundreds of millions of dollars, which in the late 40s and early 50s is a significant investment, especially in an area that had never really been that important. The United States, like I said, never really had much interest. So in 1950, the U.S. sent something like $400 million to support the French against the Vietnamese. So it's deeply involved, not really because it cares about Vietnam, but because the region is important and it fears that if Vietnam goes communist, there was also a rebellion in Malaya. The Korean War was underway. So the U.S. saw Vietnam as a much bigger piece of this kind of regional idea, this regional program for hegemony. So the main focus then is on these material ideas, commerce, trade, and so forth, in particular what they call the open door, the idea of free trade. The Middle East is similar, but it's based not necessarily on commerce so much as on resources. During World War II, oil and shipping lanes in the region, in the Middle East, became far more important because of World War II. And the United States actually was and had a decent relationship with the Arab states because of that. were significant elements of the United States military, especially establishment, but the entire foreign policy establishment, who were leery of being seen as being too closely connected to this new state or this new group of people who were coming in, even as they were, the Ergun and Stern gang were committing what would certainly be called terrorist atrocities and so forth. So the United States wasn't advocating that, but the United States wanted to maintain stability in that region because it wanted access to oil and to those shipping lanes, because if you're going to fight a Cold War against the Soviet Union, that region is incredibly vital. So in both places now, you see the United States taking a bigger role. In 1954 in Vietnam, the Vietnamese Revolution succeeded. It won. It defeated the French at Dien Bien Phu. And once again, Ho Chi Minh, as he had in 1945, thought he would be in charge of this unified country, but it was not to be so. The United States, at a conference in Geneva, partitioned Vietnam in half. They created artificial borders, right? Again, we know what that means. And they said that there would be elections in 1956 to unify Vietnam. Well, they were never going to have those elections in 1956. It was very clear. And so the United States uses, and it's a term I get in trouble with all the time, but I'm not backing down. The United States invented a country in Vietnam. Vietnam's one country. It has 3 regions, but it's one country, right? There's no north, and south. In 1954, the United States cuts Vietnam in half at the 17th parallel. And below the 17th parallel, it creates this country, which it will call the RVN, the Republic of Vietnam. The Republic of Vietnam did not have any kind of indigenous movement toward creating its own country, right? It was invented. And then the United States also invented regional arrangements like SEATO, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. And this occurs not coincidentally at the same time the United States created the Baghdad Pact for the Middle East. I don't see a lot of linkage. The United States isn't saying, here's Vietnam, here's Palestine. It's part of something much bigger than that. And they both fit in with that framework, especially with these regional arrangements. So they're very serious. And the United States begins increasing aid to both places. By 1954 and 55, the United States was sending in $300 to $400 million. This is after the French left and after they invented this country, the RVN, below the 17th parallel, and after they had said there will be elections in 1956. Well, there's clearly never any intention to have elections because they're going all in. In addition to that, once again, the land issue comes in, which again is very clearly parallel in Palestine. In the brief period that Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh controlled all of Vietnam, they instituted land reform programs. In 1954 and 1955, with American support, all of those were reneged upon. And so land, which had been given to peasants and others, was returned to a lot of these older landholders, many of whom were connected to the French and, who were very wealthy and very American oriented. It's striking that even in the modern world, and we're talking in the 1950s when commerce and global wars are the issue, but land is still crucial. In many ways, it's almost, kind of a definitional. If a country attempts some kind of land reform, the U.S. is against it. Land reform by itself to the U.S. is radical or communist or whatever. This goes back to the Freedmen's Bureau after the Civil War. At the same time this is happening, though, the Middle East became more important as well. Interest there was blossoming as part of these larger regional goals. The U.S. hadn't been deeply involved or interested in the Middle East, the Red Line agreements notwithstanding. But the growing influence of Zionism, the Palestine Revolution in the 1930s, and the Holocaust obviously changed all that. This movement now to resettle Jews from Europe or anywhere into the region grew increasingly popular. In 1947, the UN voted on Resolution 181, which led Israel to become a recognized state. And I would argue it was invented in the same way that the Republic of Vietnam was. The United States created these political entities in order to have this kind of air of legitimacy because they wanted their own role in these regions, didn't want to do it directly, right? Again, kind of like the idea of the gendarme or the cop on the beat or whatever, right? So these liberation movements were already present then by the 1950s, and in both places, and this is important, both were immediately met with resistance. internally. In Vietnam, the growth of the Viet Minh and the DRVN, the North Vietnamese above the 17th parallel, were posed as threats to the United States. In the Middle East, there was a significant blowback to Israel becoming a recognized state. The United States was seen, as another appendage to the British or the French or other Western imperialist countries. The South Vietnamese were actually admitted to the United Nations in 1955. So these two countries, Israel and the Republic of Vietnam, South Vietnam, now have international legitimacy, international credibility, right? But in both cases, as I mentioned, there were significant resistance immediately. There was significant resistance to it immediately. The United States wasn't the target per se. The United States wasn't doing imperialism the way the Europeans did. It wasn't sending a bunch of troops into occupied. It was using proxies and taking other measures, right? And the U.S. knew that it wasn't popular. Everybody in American official circles, when they analyzed Vietnam, said they don't want us there. They like Ho Chi Minh. They like the Viet Minh. Everybody from Dwight Eisenhower, the president, on down said if there's an election in Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh will win 80 to 90% of the vote, right? So they had to avoid that. You couldn't have, you pretend there's a democracy, you call it a democracy. This is an epic battle between democracy and communism. And in fact, in the 50s, that language was often used with the Middle East too, especially after Nasser, right? Even though obviously Nasser, he had connections to the Soviet Union getting aid and so forth. But inside Egypt, he was, attacking the Egyptian Communist Party, but it didn't matter, right? Just like today, right? It's interesting along these lines. I found this document some time ago, which I thought was really quite amazing. It was dated May 1st, 1950. It's very early on, right? And it was sent from the Department of State. Dean Acheson was Secretary of State at the time, and it was sent to diplomatic and consular officials. And the title of it was Anti-Americanism is Resurging in the Arab World. And it went on at some length, describing in detail many of the anti-American actions it had seen in Syria and Lebanon. The document could have been written yesterday, change the date and the names. It was exactly the same, right? And one part of it, though, which I really kind of, focused in on, it gave a list of the reasons why the Middle East was becoming anti-American. And one of them was, and this is a Department of State quote, one of the reasons was a sincere objection to America's part in Palestine developments. So by 1950, the United States is well aware of what its involvement in the region is doing. And so the blueprint is already in place for this expanded role. And then you see, in rapid fire, you see events like Suez in 1956. In 1953, you saw the overthrow of Mossadegh, and then you have the overthrow of the revolution led by Karim Qasim. 1958, there's an intervention in Lebanon to try to actually, at that point, prop up Camille Kamoun, and so on. So the United States is increasingly involved. And within those areas, you start to see the development of indigenous resistance. In 1960, inside southern Vietnam, the anti-American, let's call them that for a moment, forces established the National Liberation Front for South Vietnam, right? And then in 1964, the PLO was established. Something interesting, too, is the idea of, for want of a better term, geographical legitimacy. The United States will always say that, and Ken Burns and liberals say this today still, that North Vietnam invaded South Vietnam. The resistance really was in the South. The North clearly had, was run by the Communist Party of Vietnam. Most of the Southern resistance were people who were Southerners. The U.S. would say they were outsiders and they were, trained in the North to go into the South and so forth. The vast majority, almost the entire resistance in Southern Vietnam was Southern. These are people who had fought with the Viet Minh, they'd fought against the French, and they remained there. There were significant numbers of Catholics in Northern Vietnam who transferred to the South because there was a significant propaganda campaign from the U.S., from the Vatican and other groups saying, there's a very small minority of Catholics in Vietnam, but they were threatened and frightened, so they moved south. But for the most part, the resistance in Southern Vietnam was indigenous, right? And we hear this all the time, this trope of outsiders coming in and creating problems, right? But clearly, we know that and with regard to the PLO in Palestine, we know that it's an indigenous movement based on these really long-standing developments. But the same thing happens in Vietnam too. You would continue to hear this, they invaded us kind of stuff. But the reality is, first, there really weren't two Vietnams. One was just artificially invented. And the reality was that the Vietnamese fighting in the South, trying to get rid of the government, were actually Southerners themselves. When I started to understand politics later than the 60s, but not much, two of the people who were often lauded and linked together were Ho Chi Minh and Yasser Arafat, as well as Castro and Che and Nelson Mandela and others. But Ho and Arafat were always lauded on the left as part of the same struggle. And you don't have to be a communist to understand the importance of those third world revolutions. They gave each other support, but it was also important to have countries like the Soviet Union and China with regard to these smaller places, because they had what they saw as some protection. They had a little bit of cover, right? Which I think is one of the biggest differences today, because Palestine's isolated in ways that Vietnam never was. Vietnam fought on its own. It had an amazing military. It had fought invaders its entire life, but it also got significant levels of support and aid from countries like the Soviet Union and China, whereas obviously today in Gaza, there's nothing like that, and the other Arab states are not involved in ways, really at all, right? But those liberation movements in the 60s were really crucial to America. The United States, it always has this rhetoric, we were born of revolution, all that kind of stuff. The United States despised these revolutionary movements. And, there's laundry lists. I could go on and on and on and on. I mean, Fadi's been in my classes and listened to me, but obviously Vietnam and Cuba were the most important, and both failed, which I think is important as well. Inside Vietnam, the United States, which barely had much interest, began fighting a massive war. And to think Vietnam is about the size of New Mexico, I believe, right? Like Gaza is about as big as Harris County, or a little bit bigger than Harris County? Yeah. So Vietnam is obviously much bigger than Gaza, but neither of these are big, massive, huge countries, right? Inside Vietnam, in this smallish country about the size of New Mexico, the United States began to employ massive firepower. Inside the military, there was actually a great deal of resistance to the Vietnam War, because these generals and admirals said, we're preparing to fight against the Soviet Union and Europe. I mean, the idea of using B-52s, which are these massive bombers, they can saturate an area with one flight, one sortie of 1 by 2 square miles. The idea of using B-52s in Vietnam was considered crazy by Air Force generals. Yet they did it. The United States established free fire zones, search and destroy missions. They deforested entire areas with herbicides, napalm, Agent Orange, white phosphorus was used broadly. If you were to put together a list of the kinds of things the United States did, it would match with great synchronicity what's happening today with Israel. Whenever I hear white phosphorus, it immediately, my ears perk up. The United States in Vietnam, especially in the later years of the war after Nixon took over in 1969, began to attack the North more vigorously, which included bombing schools, civilian centers, hospitals, and so forth. Very similar to today. The biggest difference, though, is the DRV, and as I mentioned before, had the capacity to fight back much more strongly. It had received a great deal of military equipment from the Chinese and the Soviet Union, especially. It had surface-to-air missiles, which it used with great effect. In the famous Christmas bombings of 1972, Nixon claimed that the United States bombed Vietnam so badly they came back and negotiated, right? The reality is actually quite different. The Vietnamese in the Christmas bombing shot down an estimated 34 B-52s. And I forgot to look up, I forgot what they cost each, but the United States took significant losses in Vietnam. One thing I'd be curious, because the media hasn't said a lot about it, and I've talked to Fadi about this, is what Israel's lost in in Palestine, in Gaza today, right? Because we do see those videos. We saw those quite a bit where through, Israeli tanks are being blown up and sabotaged. And remember, in both of these places, you have similar wars. You have these kind of guerrilla wars going on too, these partisans. So I think that's kind of important to understand too. So the United States is just destroying Vietnam, right? A small country, which, the world was really aghast at that, but didn't really do much about it. Again, very similar, right? The United States would establish what they call free fire zones, where everybody in the area was considered Viet Cong. The war, in large measure, the success was based on body counts. How many of the enemy did you kill? And the old saying was, if it's dead and it's Vietnamese, it's a VC. Older people, kids, buffalo, right? So the United States is racking up these huge body counts because it's just destroying everything in sight. The United States displaced villagers. It created a strategic hamlet program in the early 60s where they took people away from the villages where they'd been living. People who had lived there, their ancestral homes, their ancestral graveyards, and so forth. They removed them and put them into these strategic hamlets, which were referred to at the time as concentration camps. So there is a forced dispossession of people in Vietnam too. So, and the one thing to keep in mind is, it's what I'm seeing today is horrific. It's chilling. I haven't seen anything like this really since the Vietnam era. But it's not unique. This is the way empires, and clearly the way the United States does things, right? It included massacres. We've probably all heard of My Lai. My Lai occurred pretty regularly, and more stuff has come out about that now. There was a force called Tiger Battalion that would go around in its area of operations and just kill entire villages. My Lai is the best known. And in My Lai, I think 400 people were killed in that particular day. And we're probably familiar with it, where American soldiers just went in and literally, filled ditches up and killed people and raped women. It was horrific, right? In that same region, in March of 1969, the United States killed 10,000 Vietnamese with airplanes, with air power, right? So we focus on the atrocities, but what you see is this entire attack based on these real violations of war. There were people who were accusing the UN of violations of international law, of war crimes, of atrocities. There were citizens' tribunals led by the famed philosopher Bertrand Russell. American soldiers in a group called the Vietnam Veterans Against the War had winter soldier hearings where they went around the country letting people know what they had witnessed or what they had done in Vietnam, right? And then you see this, of course, in Israel as well. The United States got closer to Israel after 1967. American aid to Israel was clearly significant from the start, but fairly temperate, relatively. So from the creation of Israel until 1959, like the first decade of its existence, the U.S. sent $650 million to Israel, and only a small percentage of that was considered military aid. In the 1960s, that increased to $834 million, and about 30% was military aid. But by the 1970s, you see this massive growth in it, up to over $16 billion, and over 70% of that is considered military aid, and then it obviously grows from there. So the United States is also making this massive economic, financial commitment to both Israel and Vietnam to try to defeat both the Viet Minh, Viet Cong, National Liberation Front, and the forces of liberation inside Palestine, right? One thing I always point out here, because I think it's important, is that Jimmy Carter had a big role in this too. Carter, did amazing things after he left the White House. I think very admirable. As president, he, even though he brokered Camp David, Carter was a friend, a real good friend to Israel. American aid. There are two major spikes in that era. You have aid, which goes up, but in 1973, there's a huge spike, right, because of the Ramadan Yom Kippur War. Then in 1979, there's another huge spike because of the Iranian Revolution and the oil embargo. Carter is responsible for that. Carter quadrupled military aid to Israel in 1979. He also fired his representative to the United Nations, Andrew Young, because Young had met against orders with Yasser Arafat and other PLO representatives at the United Nations. So this is also importantly a bipartisan movement, right? And I have all kinds of data on American support of Israel. I'm sure you're familiar with it already. There was also, and this is I just discovered this recently, so I thought it would be interesting to mention it because I myself had never even thought to look into this. But there was an intersection, there were some intersections between Vietnam and Israel itself. In 1963, Israel floated the idea of recognizing South Vietnam. South Vietnam, the U.S. had recognized South Vietnam in 1955. Israel suggested to the U.S. as a show of support that it would recognize South Vietnam, the Republic of Vietnam, at the UN. And the United States said no. I'm not sure if this was still Kennedy or Johnson. I forgot to look up the date. Because, and this is an important issue at the time, the U.S. was afraid that if Israel was linked to South Vietnam, it would alienate liberal Jewish voters in the United States. And that became really an important issue throughout the duration of the war. This idea that most American Jews were very liberal and many already were starting to question Vietnam. And they obviously weren't going to question Israel, but if Israel were linked to South Vietnam, to this U.S. war in Vietnam, then that would be problematic, right? On the other side, the North Vietnamese did recognize the PLO in 1968. So there's already a link. But the one with Israel and South Vietnam I found really quite interesting. Israel did play a role in the Vietnam War. Not a big one, but it did provide some fairly limited military advisors and training. And a lot of this is symbolic. It's a way of saying to the U.S., we're with you, right? And it was, I think to some degree, it's a way of saying thank you for what you've given us, right? But military advisors and training were important, especially in areas of counterinsurgency and special operations, which became a huge industry, and it still is, right? In the 80s, Israel was very active in these areas in Central America where the United States was trying to overthrow or stop these liberation movements like Guatemala and Salvador and Nicaragua and stuff. Israel had a huge role. They would often set up the internal security apparatuses in these places. Israel provided some munitions and equipment, shared some intelligence, gave them some legitimacy with diplomatic relations. Interestingly, after Israel, the U.S. rejected Israel recognition of South Vietnam in 1963. However, a couple of years later, in 1965, the United States significantly increased its role in Vietnam. It was a massive escalation of the war. The war wasn't going well at all. It was never going well. And so in 1965, the United States actually reached out to Levi Eshkol, the prime minister, and asked if Israel could take a bigger role in Vietnam. They wanted more assistance. This time it was Israel which was reluctant. By 1965, Israel believed it had gained more international credibility and legitimacy and didn't need that association with the U.S. the way it had before. Lyndon Johnson, the president, wrote to Levi Eshkol that if Israel supported Saigon, it would give a clear signal to the world of Israel's support for resistance to aggression in Vietnam, right? But the Israelis at the time didn't do it. They didn't think it was in their best interest, right? I suspect people who believe that Israel has significant control over American foreign policy could cite something like this as part of that. In the summer of 1965, Israel began meeting with Vietnamese officials to discuss what kind of support they might give or what they might need. They did seek, South Vietnam began to seek Israeli recognition in 1965. But this time, in a flip, Levi Eshkol said that he couldn't do it because if Israel was going to recognize South Vietnam, the Republic of Vietnam, then would also have to recognize North Vietnam, right? Which really pissed the United States off. Dean Rusk and others were very angry, essentially, like, after all we've done for you, and you can't even do this. The other piece where I saw an intersection occurred in 1969 after Golda Meir became prime minister. In 1969, Richard Nixon gave his famous silent majority speech. He said, yeah, there's people out in the streets opposing the war, but most Americans don't. The silent majority supports us. Golda Meir sent him a note congratulating him, saying, what a great act of courage. Blah, blah. The note was leaked. And inside Israel, it caused a firestorm. There was a kind of a pro-American paper named Mariv and they attacked Meir for supporting Nixon. So clearly, public opinion in both Israel and among liberal Jews in the United States was anti-Vietnam War, right? Inside Israel, after Meir's message to Nixon was leaked, a rabbi named Balfour Brickner, gotta love it, you name your kid Balfour. So it says a lot, right? You know what he's going to do, right? But he was a director of interfaith activities for Reform Judaism, said, Golda Meir has driven a wedge between herself and the liberal intellectual Jews of America, who saw no conflict in supporting Israel's struggle while opposing the unjust, unwise war in Vietnam. He said that Meir reaching out to Nixon would alienate many of Israel's friends and America's academic community. How quaint, they cared about what professors thought back then, because no one's asking me my opinion on anything right now, right? And they should, I'm not doing it at Columbia. It would alienate liberal Protestants and Catholics in the clergy and among politically active young people with liberal inclinations, right? Both of these countries then, both of these situations are part of this global anti-colonial movement for national liberation, and they're getting the same response, and that's important. And as I said, I could talk about Cuba, I could talk about Venezuela, I could talk about Brazil, I could talk about Guyana. It's just going on all over the place. It's also interesting because one of my side gigs, I call it, is I am often at war with Oliver Stone's people over the Kennedy assassination. The assassination itself, I don't care about, but their basic argument is that Kennedy was a man of peace and he was going to change the world and he was going to get out of the Vietnam War. One of the things they cite is that Kennedy stood up to Israel. I'm still not seeing that. And I actually look at all the documents. I don't look at vignettes like they do, right? So the United States took basically the same approach to events in Palestine. The PLO was immediately labeled a terrorist organization. Aid increased to governments in that region, as I said, as part of this regional arrangement as well, right? And in both places, you also saw regional wars. Last night, as I said before, when I saw the news about about Israel striking Iran, and this occurs just months after an invasion of Lebanon and events in Syria and so forth, it reminded me of Cambodia. Especially in early 1970 when the U.S. actually invaded Cambodia. But from 1969 on, the United States dropped millions of tons of bombs in both Cambodia and Laos. One thing that I've thought about with regard to Gaza today, in Laos, there are still, this is 2025, 50 years later, there are still 80 million unexploded little bombs, the bomblets from cluster bombs, right? That were used in Laos, right? And the level of environmental destruction still really hasn't been reckoned with, right? Who knows what Gaza will look like going forward, right? But it's really a terrifying thought. Vietnam, again, though, as I point out, was fortunate in that it could get outside support from places like the Soviet Union and China. The axis of resistance, the so-called active resistance, is very different, right? It does have a level of involvement, in supporting the fights, but nowhere near what countries like, the Soviet Union or China would, right? So they're under siege as well. The United States could go after Laos and Cambodia, but it's not going to go after the Soviet Union and China. And in fact, Nixon creates a détente specifically with the Soviet Union and China. The United States understood Vietnam was a bad idea and began to look for outlets after Nixon took over, especially Kissinger in 1970 said this is going to be the year of Europe. And we're going to reach out to the Europeans because Vietnam is a bad idea. There's nothing similar to that now, right? Where everybody just doubles down on what is already clearly a genocide, right? Another part that's important, but again, plays out differently, is global condemnation. By the later 1960s, the U.S. was really getting an earful from its allies. And I've seen documents on that from the British, from the French and others saying, you're destroying the alliance. You are giving the Soviet Union massive propaganda victories. You're destroying the global economy, which is a real issue with these wars, right? So they're encouraging the United States to get out of Vietnam or to delay it or to de-escalate or whatever. Eventually, the U.S. does. I would argue, and I'm not in any way, I respect the hell out of the anti-war movement. I would argue the United States finally de-escalates in Vietnam because the global economy requires it. And I've often wondered like how that will play out today because we're obviously in a time of real precarious economic conditions, right? But so far today, those major allies continue to support the United States, places like the UK and Germany. Now, lately, we've seen what I would still call more or less performative changes in that, right? And I don't know how those are going to play out, but they tend to be, kind of smaller. You see these statements coming out of places like the UK or Italy or Spain. And that, I think, eventually is really going to be crucial. By itself, it's very difficult to defeat the empire, especially an empire like the United States directly in Vietnam, where it's just, the United States dropped 4.6 million tons in a place the size of New Mexico. The United States is subsidizing it, but it has the same effect today, right? Another thing that I think is important is that we've seen an abandonment of what used to be called soft power, right? Not that I'm a proponent of soft power, but they don't even try that anymore. They immediately go straight to the most violent responses possible. This is also true of resistance at home. The anti-war movement is now met with violent and immediate resistance. There's no assumption. I mean, Trump does not differentiate between like nonviolent or violent protest or whatever, right? They're all to be met the same way, right? And we obviously saw that. I know you had an event with the directors of the encampments on the podcast we interviewed them a couple of weeks ago. And one thing that struck me, like just to take Colombia for an example, in 1968, when SDS occupied Hamilton Hall because of the Vietnam War, they actually went into the building and took over several offices. They took over the dean's office, the provost's office. There are pictures of them. They have their feet up on the table. They're smoking the provost's cigar, drinking his sherry. It took a week for the Colombia administration to bring in the police. And the removal, they roughed them up and stuff. But now it's immediate. It's immediate and it's rough and it's violent. And you didn't see that either, right? It took years for the United States in America. The other part, though, that I think is somewhat hopeful is it did take a long time. In Vietnam, Noam Chomsky and others have said the first actions they ever saw didn't occur until like around 1965 when the war was well underway. Now it's immediate. It's immediate, right? On campuses, in communities, and elsewhere. So that may be some cause for hope, right? I could talk about this forever, but let me kind of just, to sum up, I think Gaza is an example of the lessons of Vietnam, but I think a lot of it is that the ruling class has learned those lessons too. And they're doing things differently. They're doing things immediate. They're hitting with a level of force that they hadn't used before. The ideas are the same. The goal is the same, to defeat liberation movements. These movements could be called communist. They could be called terrorist, right? In Vietnam, the rationale for opposing them or opposing anti-war people was that they were communists or they were communist dupes. Today, calling somebody Hamas fills the same role, right? In 1969, Ho Chi Minh is the new Hitler. They're a bunch of terrorists. Today, it's Hamas, right? It's an old playbook, and they've learned well from it, right? So I think understanding, I'm not sure how much it helps nowadays, because let's face it, it's a fairly bleak situation. But I think understanding America's long time resistance to movements like this and the links to which it will go to defeat these movements, often very violent means, right, is worth knowing. But within that, I do think that there are ways that these people who I really admire the hell out of, right, these groups who are out there. It's interesting not to single out JVP, who I think does great stuff. I don't want to shortchange Palestinians resisting as well. But JVP often reminds me of a very important group in the Vietnam era, VVAW, the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, because veterans had a particular kind of credibility and legitimacy. They were in the war. And I think JVP kind of has that too, which is why you see the media pay so much attention to them. It makes it a little bit harder, I think. It wasn't that easy in the 60s to say, oh, those guys are a bunch of communists. They're veterans. They were fighting in Vietnam. And in the same way, it's a little harder, I guess, to say that JVP is anti-Semitic, but who knows? I want to end, because I often do this, with a poem by Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh was a great poet, and he was kind of whimsical, but I always like this one because it kind of shows the sense of kind of hope that he had. He wrote this when he was under arrest. Ho Chi Minh was under arrest many times in various places. But as he was in prison, he wrote, "Being chained is a luxury to compete for. The chained have somewhere to sleep. The unchained haven't. The state treats me to its rice. I lodge in its palaces. Its guards take turns escorting me. Really, the honor is too great." Ho wrote that at a very bleak and dark moment in Vietnamese history. He was imprisoned. The French, the Viet Minh were fighting against the French and the Japanese, and then eventually the French again and the Americans. And yet he saw this kind of hope, this sense of light. And it's very hard to find nowadays, right? At times like this, I often read a very famous poem by Bertolt Brecht called "To Those Born Later," which is very powerful, and I would suggest all of you look at it. But I'm going to forgo that because I think it's better to end on this note that even in the midst of the Vietnamese Revolution, Ho was in jail, Van Nguyen Giap was in jail. French authorities killed General Giap's wife. There were massive, large-scale killings of Viet Minh and Viet Minh supporters, or people who even just were accused of being Viet Minh, right? Ho still had that idea that he could be whimsical and talk about it and talk about what he called a Vietnam 10 times more beautiful. And I think people today who see, a free Palestine in the future are doing the same thing. And I think that's really critical. So thank you again, Fadi, and all of you. And I really appreciate this. Sure.
Microphones to be on. Test. All right. I hope everyone online can hear us well. Thank you so much for sticking around. We're going to have a Q&A session. Now, of course, I wish we had all the time in the world to have discussions and debates, but I know you have to leave out to Maryland and get out before the traffic worsens. So, we have a lot of questions actually that were submitted from the online chat, but I wanted to first, before I make my remarks, thank you for ending with Ho Chi Minh because, apart from being a great poet and our revolutionary leader for generations past and to come, he was, of course, everyone knows he was a very good cook as well. And when he wrote poetry, he was also working at the Ritz Hotel kitchen in Paris just before he founded the Communist Party, over the Vietnamese or founding member of the French Communist Party at the time. But again, thank you so much, Bob, for this captivating and moving talk that connected shared and interconnected struggles between the Palestinian and Vietnamese liberation movements, tying the respective plights, not only through their revolutions, but also through the role that U.S. empire has had in suppressing them on a global stage. The themes you mentioned on land, on maritime significance, a lot of people don't think of Gaza's maritime significance, but actually the massive oil reserves and gas offshore reserves that have been recently discovered, and that obviously the settler colonial regime is claiming theirs illegitimately, similar to say how the United States was very interested in Vietnam's maritime shipping routes and its mass rubber industry, because something like 10% of the world's rubber passed through those maritime chokeholds at the time. They all offer they all offer crucial insights to understanding how Israel continues to have unconditional support in the United States and its political realm. I guess if we have any questions in the audience, I know we have a small audience. We don't usually pass. I mean, I know you can hear us if you have a question, but our online viewers might not be able to. So if you have a question, we'll pass a mic. Otherwise, we have a lot of questions online that I'd like to pose. So there's no pressure at all. We're really not short. We're not pressed for time on questions. We have like a lot. All right. So I guess maybe, oh, yeah, yeah, please. But just the mic so the audience can hear us online.
Fascinating discussion. I'm just going to make a point, which it dawned on me. Throughout your entire presentation, you never use the word diplomacy. And often, the misconception of what diplomacy really is and what it's supposed to be. So I don't know if it was by accident or purposely not using the term diplomacy, but I'd like you to comment on that.
There were, at least with regard to Vietnam, there were clearly attempts to, have talks, but generally, like, think of what, the U.S. and Iran recently, just in the last few days, these essentially were ultimatum given to the Vietnamese. So, for instance, in 1968, the U.S. and Vietnam opened diplomatic talks to end the war, right? The war didn't end for another 4 years. The proposals that the Vietnamese made in 1968 and 69, which the U.S. rejected, basically formed the final agreement too. Diplomacy was seen in many ways as a ploy, a tactic to go look at the world and say, look, we're trying to stop, we're trying to save them, right? Just like in the last few days, Trump has claimed that, he wants to negotiate with Iran and, and he's upset that Israel is, I think that's obviously a smokescreen, right? That's a great question. Now, and there's, if you read the literature, there are some books on talks, diplomacy, and that was usually done through third countries like the Polish or other countries. But for the most part, the United States controlled international law. It had power. And so it would make these efforts, but it would create either conditions like toward the end of the war, one of the conditions was that the North Vietnamese, the communists, whatever you want to call them, remove all their troops from the South. Well, they just fought 25-year war. They're certainly not going to leave on the verge. And the United States knew that. Everybody knew that their victory was more or less certain. So it was mostly used, I think, as a smokescreen, but it's unfortunate, right? Because, and one of the things, I mentioned Jimmy Carter's role, but obviously Jimmy Carter, after he left the presidency, really did a lot of this, right? North Korea and places like that, with Haiti even, elections and so forth. But there's really no attempt to do that. And when it does occur, I would say it's pretty disingenuous. It's a way to kind of get public opinion behind you, right? And this is happening all over Cuba and elsewhere, pretty much anywhere the U.S. is involved. So the media will report on it, but just as a way to say, hey, look what we're doing. Yeah.
All right, Bob, I'm going to ask you, I know you addressed this in one of your throughout your talk, but we've had some audience members who showed up late to the lecture because of lunchtime breaks and all of that. So I'm going to summarize this question a little bit, but of course it touches on all of the themes you discussed earlier. Could you just retouch a little bit on how have U.S. political and economic interests, specifically those related to the MIC military-industrial complex, or geopolitical strategies influenced America's approach to suppressing liberation movements, and what does it reveal about their underlying motivations?
I think they're very important. As I mentioned, in 2022, right before, as Russia was massing troops, the heads of like Raytheon and General Dynamics tweeted, literally in public, they tweeted, this will be good for business. Our stock prices are going to go up. And, after October 2023, you saw huge increases in sales and profits by these companies. Something that's not connected, but I still think it's a really great story, is after the Vietnam War, well, actually kind of is connected. After the Vietnam War, Richard Nixon, of all people, decided that the United States needed to tone down the Cold War. Nixon comes off looking pretty good in the Cold War era, right? And this is when you get the Strategic Arms Limitation Agreement with the Soviet Union. They're going to build fewer nuclear weapons and so forth, right? Nixon, the peacemaker. Nixon was immediately attacked, right, as being naive and weak and so forth. And a group in the United States came together called the Committee on the Present Danger. And the idea of the Committee on the Present Danger was that the United States is still at risk. For a brief moment in the mid-70s, the Soviet Union had more nuclear missiles than the US did. Didn't have anywhere near the number of launchers, so it didn't really matter, right? Without launchers, not a lot you can do. But the Committee on the Present Danger was bankrolled by those companies, by the military industrial companies. And it had people involved like John Wayne was part of it, Ronald Reagan, but it was mostly these businesses. And they got to Gerald Ford, and when Ford was president, he had actually commissioned a study by the CIA to analyze the Soviet Union, and CIA was led by George Bush at the time, the old man. And the study came back from the experts who understood the region very well, the Soviet Union, and said, Soviet Union's in trouble. They're very weak. The economy is failing. We really don't have a lot to worry about. Bush, the director of Central Intelligence, George Bush, he threw it away, stuck it in a safe and hid it, and brought a new group in, Tim B, which came in with a very different analysis. We're in trouble, and we need a massive arms buildup. That's clearly connected to the military industrial complex, absolutely. You see the same thing when the Soviet Union fell apart, and a lot of people are saying, we have a peace dividend now. We don't need NATO. We didn't need to be spending all this money. Military industrial company created an organization in like 91 or 92 to expand NATO. That was done by the American military weapons. So yeah, they have a huge role. There's a very famous book from World War I by a guy named Randolph Bourne called Intellectuals in the State, where he brings that up. It's an old story. And, they're in many ways just very keen. Well, I mean, didn't Trump, what did he say in Saudi? They pay in cash or something like that, right? So they don't really even hide it anymore. But yeah, that's important. Absolutely. I would argue, the war in Kosovo in the 90s, a lot of that was basically to give NATO something to do, to give them a purpose, because the whole idea there, what do we need NATO for anymore, right?
Yeah.
Even today, and not to in any way defend Putin, when lefties call Putin a communist, it's maddening, right? But this is one country surrounded by 31 different states in an alliance. So yeah, that's very important.
Yeah, I just want to ask a follow-up to it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's my own. As we see today in the genocide in Gaza, Israel uses it as a platform. Of course, a lot of scholars have theorized of, say, Gaza being an experiment in the laboratory for weapons and new technology.
Yeah.
Of course, we see this in Project Lavender with the AI ways of supposedly targeting what they claim as terrorists, but it's just wiping out entire buildings, or using algorithms to determine where the next strikes are going to be. In the context of Vietnam, I mean, there were new weapons being used there, like Agent Orange and other forms of chemical weapons we hadn't seen. Would the U.S. market it in turn at like global weapon expos and like the same way that Israel does today?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Even though like Dow Chemical became a huge target of anti-war protests, but in terms of business, it was great for Dow. They could go around and say, look at what we did. We protected American soldiers with this stuff, right? We destroyed the cloud cover, so there's no place for the Viet Cong to hide or anything like that. Yeah, so it's a major part of it. At one point, it's funny because now I'm reading about AA, which I'm not sure I understand that well, but Robert McNamara at one point created something called the McNamara line, which was this massive, intricate series of electric like sensors and things like that, which he thought would replace patrols. So instead of putting Americans in, jeopardy, he would just have this, the McNamara line, and it didn't work. It wasn't advanced enough, but that becomes a precursor, right? Much of it, even if the technology doesn't pan out, the R&D investments are massive, right? It's like Star Wars, or what's Trump calling it now, the Golden Dome, right? Mm-hmm. Star Wars was never going to be built, but I forget how many hundreds of billions was appropriated for R&D on something that was never going to be built. And I think you're probably seeing something similar today. So yeah, absolutely. Big part of it. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
And it is a laboratory. Absolutely. And third world countries, so-called third world countries, less developed countries, are generally the laboratories. We try it out there. We try it out in Latin America. We try it out in Mexico, try it out in Cuba, or wherever, in the Cold War, it was like, we need to try it out here to see if it'll work in the Soviet Union. I would argue there was never really anywhere near a serious possibility of the U.S. and Soviet Union fighting against each other, but the rhetoric was important.
Yeah, so I have a longer question to ask you from one of our audience members who's curious to ask about the U.S.'s contradictory rhetoric on their foreign interventions. And this is the question I'm reading. For example, the U.S. said that they have no role in Israel's attack on Iran yesterday, and at the same time stating any retaliation attempts will have consequences. And that has been the case earlier too. How can we interpret this rhetoric? Why do they want to distance themselves from an open conflict while also continuously using threatening language? Is it also related to what you touched on earlier about the US controlling Israel through though certain actions make it look like it's the other way around, to the extent several political commentators commenting on this as Israel dragging or commented on this as Israel dragging the US into a war? Yeah. Sorry for the long question.
No problem at all. The Iran thing, I've been reading for 2-3 days now that an Israeli attack is imminent. If it's in the New York Times, I was going to say Trump gets in his daily briefings, but he doesn't read those. So, but you got to believe somebody up there knew, right? I mean, the idea that they were caught off guard is preposterous, right? So it serves, I don't even know anymore what purpose it serves, because, especially now we live in this period of immediate news, right?
Yeah.
Vietnam was quaint. You had to wait sometimes days to find out what was actually happening there. Now it's immediate. So everybody knows that it's a facade. So I'm not really sure why they're doing it. I mean, they control the international courts, or they reject the international courts, and they can control the UN. So yeah, I don't know. What was that last part? Because there was something I wanted to say about that. I forgot.
I can show you the actual question. Where is it? Here.
Oh, it was just at the very end you mentioned something that I wanted
I
to.
think it is also related to what you touched on earlier about the US controlling Israel. Those certain actions make it look like it's the other way around.
I do still believe that the United States is the hegemonic force and Israel's a sub-imperial power, as I said at the beginning. And one thing I will say, though, that is different for me and actually very chilling is what's happening here at home. Like the idea now that, when I'm retired, thankfully, but in Texas, I could criticize the US government. I could stand up and say, Donald Trump is a war criminal, no problem. But I can't say that about Israel. That's different. And in that regard, in these ideas, Israel does have a level of, I don't know if you'll call it control, but that part's different, which I've never seen before. I don't believe in the region Israel's going to do anything. It'll take measures. There's an old, I don't remember, I'm not a political theorist, but, years ago, there was somebody writing about how the client actually gains power over the patron, right? And in southern Vietnam, I think that was clearly the case. The US was telling in the Diem years, the Ngo Dinh Diem, the guy they put in power, kind of the American puppet, right? Well, I wouldn't call him a puppet. Actually, he's not a puppet, because the US would be telling him to do things to kind of, give a veneer of democracy. And he refused because he knew the US wasn't going to get rid of him. And, when people were saying like, oh, it'll just take a phone call and they can stop Netanyahu and this and that, it's like, I'm not so sure. So in that regard, I do think the US still has control. But Israel clearly, in that regard, as a client in a vital area to the United States, and the US, think of the credibility the US would believe it was losing. So yeah, I think that's the case. I would still argue that it's the cop on the beat, but there are very frightening developments, and especially here at home, like on campuses where people are having their diplomas revoked for a speech or something. Yeah.
I mean, there definitely was a time where, you could say that the US government would put a limit on Israel, say, for instance, during the Suez aggression of 1956, or when, crazy to think that, somebody as reactionary as Reagan would have found the bombing of children too horrific for him to see on the daily, to ultimately push them to put an end to
Bush refused loans because of the settlements. Yeah.
Bush the father, that is.
Bush the father, the old man.
Yeah, because the younger, the son was completely different. But yeah, I mean, in Texas, when I joined in 2019, we had to sign this waiver saying that we won't boycott Israel to receive any state money as a state institution. And I refused to sign it. I was willing to have my PhD admission revoked for it. And thankfully, just at the time, there was an injunction that the court issued, suspending that motion at the time. But for those who might not know, is that this was put in place after Hurricane Harvey. Yeah, Hurricane Harvey in 2017, that in order to receive federal aid from the Texas government after your homes got destroyed or your livelihood was ruined, you had to sign a contract saying that you would not be engaged in the boycott of Israel to receive funding from Texas. So it's horrific to see that. But then again, we can say today, I refuse to spend a single dollar that's made for the US, and you won't face any consequences.
Yeah, that part is chilling.
Yeah, but Bob, I wanted to perhaps there are other questions, but maybe I wanted to invoke one because or pose one because you highlighted it a little bit just now. The contours were different around getting news on Vietnam, but there are some technological parallels given the ages we were in. Say, Vietnam was the first televised war, right? Gaza is seen as the first live stream genocide. So how do you see these two like playing with one another? How did it like inform public opinion in ways that weren't possible, say, in other
I
liberation
think
struggles?
media was important. I mean, the news, first of all, the news was, I think, wasn't an hour long, and you would have long segments, about Vietnam. I mean, not 22 seconds, like several minutes, and the famous scenes, burning down a Vietnamese hut with a Zippo lighter, and the famous image of the Vietnamese colonel shooting somebody in the head, or the little girl attacked by napalm. The media initially, was pretty supportive of the war, but then you started to see, especially the New York Times, people like Neil Sheehan and David Halberstam and others come out and criticize the war. And that's important. Time magazine one week had an issue with the photos of all of the Americans killed in Vietnam that week. It was in 1968 during Tet. So it was over 2,000, right? So one of the things that I was initially encouraged about was when I first started seeing these images like Instagram and TikTok and whatever from Gaza. And the scary part of it is that, as you point out, they've live streamed a genocide. It doesn't matter. I mean, it's just kind of casual, right? And so you see these images, you see these photos, and it doesn't move people at all, right? And that's the part that is like, now, if it weren't there, we wouldn't know much of this, which would be even worse, right? We are aware of it. And let me say, let's make this clear too. We're talking about the United States. The rest of the world is very different in this. Even the US is, I mean, one of the things that I find amazing is that recent polls show a majority of Americans now hold a negative view of Israel. I never imagined I would see that. Every demographic except older white Republicans now has a critical view of Israel. Now, does that matter? It hasn't so far, right? And obviously in the US, the problem too is now we've got so many things to deal with, right? You got ICE and you've got this and that and parades and all that. So it's very hard to focus in on one thing. Yeah.
Yeah, no. If you'll allow me, Bob, there was one question that was posed that I think I might be better poised to respond to because of the language and translation.
Sure.
It's just a simple one. Somebody asked from Zoom, how much vocal, visible, and visible solidarity were we seeing between the NLF, National Liberation Front, obviously, and the PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization? I mean, if you want to take a stab at it too afterwards, I'll just go and answer a few things. I was glad this was brought up actually because, we usually don't have these posters in the front of our office, usually that part of our artworks in our staff installations. But as you can see behind me here, we have, I don't know if our Zoom audiences will be able to see, but we have a poster that says Revolution Until Victory in many languages, of them Vietnamese and Arabic, that was designed, I think it was by Tricontinental or OSPAL. I'm not sure about that one. I can't say with specificity. But on the other side, and the flag is might be blocking it right now, is that we have a poster, an original poster from the General Union of Palestinian Students from 1970 that says something like Vietnam, Rhodesia, South Africa, and Palestine. So the interconnectedness of the struggle. And, I encourage the reader, the guest who posed this question, to look up the Palestine Poster Project online because it contains a wealth of archival images and data on posters and solidarity flyers and the like. But I also, lastly, the reason why I wanted to answer it was because I pulled up from my collection this mini pamphlet. Now, it might not be visible on online, for our viewers online, but this is actually from Fatah, the Palestinian National Liberation Movement. They had an 11-part series on studies, revolutionary studies and experiences, and volume 5, published in 1966, was actually التجربة الفيتنامية, the Vietnamese experience. So from very, very early on, there was a very high educational awareness, not only in Palestinian circles, but amongst anti-colonial movements of each other's struggles. And this goes the same too for Palestine. I mean, from very early on, like you said, Ho Chi Minh by 1968 had recognized the PLO. The colonized world at the time, of course, it was a different era. That was known as the third, referred to as the third world. world had not only interconnected struggles, but also had shared outlooks of the world and understood that oppression is oppression in however form it may take, under imperial rule, under settler colonialism, under reactionary military juntas, and the like. So there was a deep and shared sense of solidarity in all of the Palestinian magazines. Because I don't read Vietnamese, there are countless articles online that I encourage people to look at from the organizations of the Palestinian Revolution that detailed articles about Vietnam, from news updates to the liberation to poetry and so on. But if you had anything,
Well, no, just as I began, I mean, that's how I learned about Palestine. I read it, it seemed odd. So I said, well, I know a little bit about Vietnam and this seems similar enough. And what they're saying is very different. And in the 70s, especially when I kind of started to come of age, yeah, I mean, you talked about Vietnam, you talked about Cuba, you talked about South Africa, you talked about Palestine. So it was there. And Arafat, we can reckon with what he became later in life, but he was iconic. I mean, he was one of those people. Like if there were a Mount Rushmore, it would have, been like Ho and Fidel, and he would have been on there as well. So it's absolutely vital. I was in Cuba about 8 years ago, and I bought a bunch of posters, as you pointed out, which are wonderful. And there were a bunch of Cuban posters about Vietnam, Ventura, but there were also Palestinian posters all over Cuba, from the 60s. So absolutely vital. Yeah. Part of that global, which gave us all a great deal of hope at the time.
And I will say, I mean, this might be controversial to some, but if you want to look from a militaristic analysis, I mean, General Giap's formulation of tunnel warfare and underground warfare was one that was very much adopted by Palestinian resistance forces, especially Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas, the Palestinian, the leading resistance force operating in Gaza now, is that they understood that above ground, the conditions for guerrilla warfare were impossible, so that the only solution was to combat the enemy and operate in ways that the enemy could not understand. And there was a big sort of, I would say, misinterpretation when October 7th happened, that there was all these conspiracies that Israel allowed it to happen, and Israel wanted this so that they can go in and destroy Gaza and all of that. But I think there needs to be a different interpretation. Sometimes we shouldn't be giving the imperial powers that much credit and omnipresent knowledge, and sometimes you have to look at their ignorance and stupidity, really, in many senses, to not really understand the depth and significance and intricate nature of the tunnel warfare and military capacities, because Gaza has been besieged for 20 months now almost, and they're still able to conduct operations against the occupation forces. And, no matter what the international media might say, they are conducting the laws of international combat, that combat soldiers in uniform with military are, under international law, appropriate targets. Whereas on the other hand, you have Israel doing indiscriminate mass murders and destruction at wanton scale.
That's Vietnam as well. It's people's war, right? Also in honor of my dear friend from Puerto Rico was a part of this too, and they were often invoked. And inside the U.S., groups like the Young Lords or the Black Panthers often included both Vietnam and Palestine. And Black Panthers were very strong advocates of the Palestinian Revolution.
Oh, yes, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, all of these struggles did really come of age as part of the New Left. Of course, they were around for much longer, but the international connection that developed from the New Left and from the rise of anti-colonial struggles that were emerging across the Third World definitely shaped them all. I have two last questions from our audience. One is, how do feelings of grief, anger, mourning, and even hope shape international solidarity today? Do you think we need to rethink how we organize solidarity movements? I'm shortening the question.
I guess. Yeah, I mean, I don't have any answers, unfortunately. I mean, the thing is, there are solidarity movements. That's the frightening part, right? I mean, Israel has, I don't know how many decisions against it already. They can commit acts of piracy. They can stop a ship in international waters and arrest them. There's a significant level of solidarity. I mean, in fact, and Noam Chomsky always makes this point about Vietnam. Like it took years to get a movement going. Now it's pretty much immediate, right? What we're seeing today is occurring much more rapidly and at a far greater level than anything that happened in the early 60s in Vietnam. But I think the forces of power they just figure we'll ignore it, we'll ride it out. So I don't know, like in terms of, I hate to kind of fall back on big powers, but I think, the fact that, well, the Vietnamese had a regular army too. It was a people's war, but they also had a regular army, way bigger than anything Hamas or anybody else would have, right? But they also had the Soviet Union and China, which not only provided them with aid, but mitigated against the U.S. doing too much. Some people say the U.S. was thinking about dropping an atomic bomb on Vietnam. I've actually never seen credible evidence of that because China is on the border,
Yeah, no, exactly.
and Israel doesn't have, other than Yemen, doesn't really have. I'm sorry, Palestine doesn't have that outside of Yemen.
Yeah, no. And it goes back to what you were saying earlier, especially in the sense that, if you look at Israel as being the regional cop, the dynamics in the past was that the U.S. always wanted an Israel, especially post 1967, that was more powerful than all the Arab armies combined. But now we have a very different dynamic where half the regimes have normalized and are facilitating the genocide or providing cover for it, and the other half are either silent, trying to normalize, or meddled with their own horrors from years of imperial destruction in their own lands. So, the last question I wanted to ask you from the audience is maybe perhaps a more uplifting one. Do you think that an internationalist anti-colonial politics that you saw emerge in the 1960s continues today?
Yeah. Yes. No, I mean, that part has been encouraging. Yes, absolutely. And you're also seeing connections, just to use her because she's so one on Greta Thunberg, right? Who's making this connection between the climate crisis in Gaza, right? And a lot of people, as you know, on our podcast, we feature a lot of people who talk about this. So yeah, you are definitely seeing people who are making these connections in ways which is really, really encouraging, really inspirational. You have far more connection. You have, inside the United States, you have significant levels of students from Palestine and elsewhere. At least now they're still here. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, that's why I kind of ended with Ho's poem, which is kind of, because even in the face of this immense darkness, he's in prison. He doesn't know if he's even going to get out, but he's able to kind of think of a brighter day ahead, right? The last line in the poem I mentioned, by Brecht to those born after, where he talks about, not being able to defeat the Nazis, basically. And his last line is, for those of you, born later, please look upon us with forbearance. Like, and there's always an element of that, but no, there's stuff going on out there, right? And, I'm not, there's always been this idea of like pushing the destruction, right? Forcing the issue. I don't want to see that because Donald Trump might blow up the world, and these people, not just Trump, but these systems might blow up the world, right? At the same time, they are reaching this point where they are creating their own opposition, maybe creating their own destruction.
Yeah. No, thank you so much for this, Bob, and thank you so much for everyone sticking around. Part of learning from under you means I too end with poems, and a lot of my speeches are introduced with them. But, with all the horrors, we learned so much from your talk today. Even I did, having sat through so many of your classes and teaching, being a teaching assistant for one of them, is that amidst all of the horrors we see, there is optimism through liberation struggles and through revolutionary currents. And I just wanted to end with an Arabic poem by a famous Egyptian blind poet. His name was Sheikh Imam, and I'll say it in Arabic before translating it. Is that يا فلسطينية فيتنام عليكم البشارة بالنصرة طالعة من تحت 100,000 غارة والشمعة والعة. So, oh Palestinians, Vietnam has news from you. Under 100,000 bombs, victories emerging, and the candles still burning. So, with that, I mean, the Vietnamese lost upwards of 2 million people in the horrific in decades of occupation and war, not even factoring the Cambodian and Laotian people who also were murdered and had their life stolen from them. And of course, there's no equivalency, like one death is too many in any single context, but there is hope that despite all of the suffering we see in Palestine, that there a future for a liberated one it could be in our lifetime, and we'll strive to it. So with that, I wanted to thank everybody in person and online for joining us, and wish you a great afternoon and evening wherever you may be. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to you,
Thank
Bob,
you.
as well.
Thank you.